said, two things, which I wonder if you could comment on. One is carbon sequestration and the role that that will have in lessening the impacts of climate change, and the other is fourth generation fast breeder reactors.
Yeah, carbon sequestration, you know, this, I have a paper that's being, which will hopefully soon be published. The reviews were good and we have to make some revisions, but in that paper, which is called Scientific Prescription for Avoiding Dangerous Climate Change to Protect Young People and Nature, we show that to keep climate close to the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, you would need to reduce emissions several percent a year, beginning almost immediately. And you need to sequester some carbon. And you can probably sequester naturally with improved agricultural and forestry practices. You can probably get about 100 gigatons of carbon. And if we would reduce emissions 5 or 6% a year, then that would actually let us get back to 350 parts per million this century, and we would stabilize climate. Now, in reality, it's going to be difficult to do that, but we should not, that doesn't mean that, oh, okay, because it looks like we can't quite do that, that we should say, oh, then we're going to go off the other end. If we just marginally go over that, then we may be able to burn biofuels at a power plant where you do capture the CO2 and sequester it, but there's a limit. We may have to do something like that if we want to stabilize the planet's energy balance this century. So a small amount of what I would call soft geoengineering, capturing some CO2 and sequestering, may turn out to be necessary if we don't get reductions started very soon. But there's a limit as to how much you could do that. So that's no, even if that is conceivable, that's no reason to not push for changes as rapidly as possible. With regard to fourth generation nuclear power, I mean, some places, in my opinion, we can make safe advanced generation nuclear power, but it's a topic which some people find abhorrent, which I think it's mostly misinformation, but I don't think we need to be concerned about that. If we put a price on carbon, then the alternatives will compete. And we have one country, Germany, which is trying very hard. They've got good engineers, and they're willing to pay the costs of trying to integrate an intermittent energy source into their electrical system. So we have to let these things compete. I think there's tremendous potential for advanced generation nuclear. And I think in the case of China, for example, if we take the best of the fourth generation nuclear power and simply replace the coal burners and leave the rest of the electrical distribution system as it is, you could actually remove China's coal emissions very rapidly. And I don't see any other way to do it, frankly. And they already have nuclear capabilities, so you're not making the world more dangerous by doing that. So I think there is a role for that, but we don't have to get into that argument. We don't, for the sake of what really needs to be done, and that's the price on carbon.
Yes, I'm Matt Grossnickel from Wisconsin, and thank you very much for coming. I loved your talk today. I would like to bring up the topic of most of us going to the Hill tomorrow, and we run into a variety of politicians, especially conservatives, that fear the changes that we're going to present. They're going to fear the end or gradual phasing out of subsidies to fossil fuels, and especially they fear carbon fee and dividend. And since fear is such a strong motivating factor, especially for politicians, I would like your suggestions of how we might approach our politicians' fear of the major changes that need to take place.
Well, frankly, I think conservatives do not actually fear they actually support removing subsidies. And again, Shailing will be able to discuss this much better than I can. But most conservatives would like things to be priced honestly. And they're not priced honestly if there's things that are subsidized and if the different energy sources do not pay their cost to society. So that's why, for example, George Shultz wrote an article a month or so ago in the Wall Street Journal arguing for exactly what we're talking about, like a fee and dividend approach, which is revenue neutral. The government does not get bigger. What conservatives fear is government getting bigger. And that's why, and I agree with them. I think that we can't let the left, the liberals, take the money from a carbon fee and use it to make government bigger. The money has to go to the public. So I think you will find that conservatives are actually maybe our best friend. But they have to be true conservatives. I mean, unfortunately, the fossil fuel industry is supporting more one party, but they support both parties.
Dr. Hansen, I wonder if you would engage in a speculation. You've said for a while that time is running short. Is there a level of CO2 in the atmosphere that gets too high? And could you speculate anything that might be dramatic enough to really get people's attention? For those of us who look at the climate change, it's already very dramatic, but somehow it doesn't seem to penetrate those who are still kind of denying it.
Yeah, well, that's the difficulty with this whole problem. It's the irreversible long-term things which are the greatest concern, at least to me. And if we let it get to the point where we won't be able to stop ice sheet disintegration, and that means, a substantial fraction of the cities are located on the coastline. But that's not the kind of thing which you're going to see in even 10 years or 20 years. You're not going to see large sea level rising. But we can see the physics of what's going on, and we can say, oh my gosh, this is soon going to be at a point where we can't stop the ice sheet disintegration. What you want to see is these large individual events, and we are going to see more of those because the extreme events, the tails of those events are getting significantly more frequent. So we may see some regional things, but then you have the problem that a single event usually cannot be ascribed with 100% confidence to global climate change. And so you have to look at the frequency of those. And that we are beginning to get. In the case of temperature, we were able to show that frequency has changed noticeably. But we do have to, it's a hard problem. But the science is actually clear. If it weren't muddled by intentional misinformation, then the public would probably be persuaded by this point. But unfortunately, we have to fight that misinformation. So it just makes our job more difficult, but that's why the kind of approach that Citizens Climate Lobby is using is absolutely essential. Marshall Saunders says, respect, just continuing to tell the truth, and eventually we're going to win, but we have to win as soon as possible.
I'm so glad you brought up Calgary, because last summer I went to visit my daughter in British Columbia and took the bus back to Toronto, and I made a stop in Calgary, and I thought, people are good, they just want to know, they're afraid of losing their jobs, so they're not speaking up, and they don't have time to research what they can do about climate change. So I asked where the busiest corner in Calgary was, and there's a pedestrian street, and on one side of the street is Home Oil. On the very opposite side is the bank tower. So both towers are opposite. I stood in the middle, and I have a handout for climate change, which I kept here for the Citizens Climate Lobby. And I went up to people and said, because they're just streaming, the suits are streaming from one tower to the next. And I said, climate change solution. And then I pulled out the handout. Every single handout was taken by the suits. They want to know what to do, and that's what we're doing. We're telling them there is something we can do, and it's so powerful, and it's so much fun. Thank you.
Dr. Hansen, thank you very much. It was an honor hearing you talk. And I say that because you were an inspiration to me and many others, doctoral students at the time at the MIT Energy Lab, and you remain an inspiration and a hero now. So thank you. What I wanted to ask is that you kind of got forced into the political arena over time. But for those of us who are scientists and engineers who are trying to bring both environmental consciousness and scientific literacy into government, in some cases by running, right? We're being induced into it younger. And I was wondering if you have advice for scientists and engineers who are taking this plunge into political activism earlier in a scientific career.
Yeah, that's always a difficult question to respond to, because it's easier for an old person like me to get arrested. I don't care about my record, and science is hard. You can't even be a good scientist on 40 hours a week. So you don't have time as a young scientist to spend a lot of time on activism. But the kind of, again, the approach of Citizens Climate Lobby, which is basically just the way science works. You have to be honest with yourself, or you're not going to be a successful scientist. And you just have to try to make that clear when you do have the opportunity to speak to the public. Just make clear how science works, and try to make clear that scientists are scientists were always very respected, because after all, you have to work very hard, and you get paid lower middle class wages. So obviously I don't have a very good answer to your question, other than just do good science, and at the same time try to communicate, because in general scientists don't do a very good job of communicating. I guess that's all I can say.
I apologize for everybody in line. Well, this is going to have to be the last question for this session. Hopefully we get to more with Dr. Suba. Go ahead. Oh, Grant, go ahead.
There are many reasons why I'm standing here, why I came to this conference. Many reasons. The single most important is the schools of my grandchildren. Thank you. As a recent grandparent, it's become personal for me as well. My question to you is, at the end when you said, I'd like to put your contact information up here when I close my doors, I couldn't help but notice that above us was 350. And my question for you is one that's really driving me, because it's very exasperating and frustrating for me to see and agree with you 100% with the point you made so well. There's one thing we need to do. The one most important, powerful thing that we can do to help shift this is the revenue neutral carbon tax. 350 is not doing that. Why are they not? Can you help them move? Because they've got so many more people. They're not always very peaceful. They don't always show up with love. But they have the boots on the ground, and they can help us make a difference. Can you help them change their mind?
Bill McKibben's a good friend, and he had called me several years ago and told me he was going to form this organization, 450.org. I said, well, wait a moment. What has become clear, and I'm working on a paper which I think will make it very clear that actually 450 is on the long run a disaster scenario. That would force us back toward initially the temperature of the last interglacial, which is 2 degrees Celsius warmer. But then it's also going to bring into play slow feedbacks that on the longer run would make it even warmer. Now, I understand your frustration with that, because and it did turn out that young people had the interesting thing is about this group and usual audiences at my talk is there's more older people than young people. But young people do have the potential to make a big impact. In fact, in the case of Obama's election in Iowa, they got out the vote in the primary, in the caucuses, which then put Obama ahead of Hillary Clinton. And then during the election, they got out the vote. I gave talks at a few colleges where the students were so excited by that election, and they really got out the vote. So they have tremendous potential. Then the election, Obama won the election, and what happened? The Democrats were proposing a cap and trade with offsets, which is the Kyoto Protocol approach. And I had dinner with Bill, and we argued, and I said, you've got to support what will actually work. Not compromise with politicians. And so he said, well, it's up to the young people. You have to persuade my key lieutenants. And so we had these email exchanges, a series of them, and I could not persuade them. They said they go around the world, these other countries, and the U.S. is not doing anything, and even though we understand your argument that this is not going to do much, but it's better than nothing. That, unfortunately, if you follow that approach this time we've got to get it right. And if we take a political compromise like that, then we guarantee that our children are going to inherit bad situations. So, now Bill now says that we've got to get fee and dividend, but yet they're not putting that forward. But I don't think you should worry too much about that. I think because I think we have to get conservatives to be among the leaders in making us move in that direction. And then, because if it comes from the liberal side, which 350 is on the liberal side, I would say, then we're going to end up like with the Boxer-Sanders bill, where they say, we're going to take 40% of this to pay off the national debt or something, which means, you're throwing the money into the pot. I think, yeah, there will need to be, try to get multiple organizations to work together, cooperate, but for the moment, I think it's much more important to be very clear in what you're doing and to try to grow. You may not think your individual letters to the editor or your visits with congressmen are paying off immediately, but boy, if I can, you're beginning to be heard. There are now conservatives who are hearing you, and I think if we continue this track that you are on for a bit longer, I think there's a very good chance that you may actually determine the success of what happens. So it should be very exciting for you to be in that position. There's nothing in this whole business that has made me more optimistic than the growth of this organization and the fact that the leaders understand what's needed, because it's very hard to get leaders to understand what is needed. And I just let me give you one example. I had thought, well, gee, physicists like the German Chancellor Merkel should be able to understand what we're saying and realize, that you can't solve the problem if the policies are such that you're continuing to burn more of the coal and unconventional fossil fuels, then you can't solve the problem, because we know there's enough oil and gas which is easily extractable, conventional oil and gas. Saudi Arabia can get oil out for like $2 a barrel and sell it for $100 a barrel. Well, they're going to sell that oil, I can guarantee you, because there are going to be customers for that. So the conventional, easily available conventional is going to be burned. And that's enough to get us up to, if not somewhat beyond the acceptable, dangerous level. So we have to have policies that are going to lead to the unconventional being left in the ground, and then most of the remaining coal. And that requires a price on coal. Well, okay, I'm not going to tell the story about Germany. It's a little too long a story. But the point was, the bottom line of it was that it's not easy to get politicians, even if their heart is in the right place, as Germany's is, to take the actions that are actually going to work. And so to understand why we need the policies that you're pushing, we need to listen to the next speaker.